Around the year 410, the Emperor Honorius, beset by threats closer to home, issued his famous rescript to the civitates of Britain, advising them to see to their own defences. This act was less a deliberate abandonment and more a pragmatic acknowledgement of a reality that had been unfolding for decades. The regular supply of coinage had ceased, interrupting the cash-based economy that sustained the professional army and administration. Legions had been progressively withdrawn to counter crises on the continent, leaving the province's extensive frontiers guarded by a dwindling number of federate troops and local militias. What remained was a complex Romano-British society, suddenly cut adrift from the central nervous system of the empire. The immediate consequence was the rapid fragmentation of political and economic life. The intricate system of taxation, supply, and governance that had connected Britannia to the wider Roman world disintegrated. Grand villas, the centres of aristocratic agricultural estates, saw their hypercaust heating systems fall cold, and their mosaic floors crack under the weight of neglect or repurposing for more rudimentary defensive functions. Large-scale industrial production, such as the mass manufacturing of pottery from centres in the Nene Valley and Oxfordshire, ground to a halt, leading to a swift return to localised, subsistence-level craft. Urban centres, the very heart of Roman administration and culture, began a slow process of decay. The stone forums and basilicas of cities like Wroxeter and Caerwent, once bustling with commerce and civic life, grew silent as their populations dwindled or shifted to more defensible locations within the old city walls. Yet, the legacy of 4 centuries under Roman rule was not so easily erased. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. Among the educated elite, Latin remained the language of administration and the church, and the idea of Romanitas, of being Roman, persisted as a powerful cultural identifier. The Christian faith, which had become organised across the province, provided a crucial framework of continuity, with its network of bishops and clergy preserving literacy and a connection to the wider European world. This persistence of Roman identity was a critical factor in the political landscape that emerged. Local magistrates and landowners, descendants of the tribal aristocracy that Rome had co-opted, took on the responsibilities of governance and defence. These regional leaders, operating from the old Roman cantonal capitals, effectively became independent rulers. In the west, in the more rugged, less urbanised territories that would one day be called Wales, this transition was subtly different. Here, Roman influence had always been more military than civil, and the pre-existing Celtic tribal structures lay closer to the surface. It was in these western lands, haunted by the memory of Roman order, but defined by a more ancient identity, that the foundations for the new medieval kingdoms were first laid, not as a rejection of the past, but as an adaptation to its sudden absence. With the imperial military structure gone, the defence of Britain fell to local strongmen, figures whom later writers like Gildas would call tyranni, or tyrants. The most prominent of these was a high king known to history as Vortigern. Described by the 6th century monk Gildas as a proud tyrant, Vortigern and a council of Romano-British leaders faced relentless military pressure. From the north, the Picts raided across the fractured remnants of Hadrian's Wall, while from the west, the Scotti of Ireland conducted seaborne attacks along the coastlines. Lacking a professional field army, Vortigern resorted to a time-honoured Roman strategy, the employment of foreign federate troops. Sometime in the mid-5th century, traditionally dated to around 449 AD, he invited Germanic mercenaries from the continent to defend his lands. The Venerable Bede, writing centuries later, identifies these warriors as Jutes, led by the brothers Hengist and Horsa. In exchange for their military service, the mercenaries were granted territory the Isle of Thanet in Kent, and were to be supplied with provisions, known as the Annona. Initially, the arrangement proved effective, as the Germanic warriors successfully repelled the Pictish incursions. The success of this first group, however, attracted more of their kin from across the North Sea, including Angles and Saxons, who saw Britain as a land of opportunity. Soon, the number of mercenaries swelled, and their demands for supplies and land increased accordingly. They complained that their monthly provisions were insufficient and threatened to break their contract. When the British Council refused to meet their escalating demands, the Federates revolted. The alliance shattered, and the hired protectors turned on their employers in an event known as the Adventus Saxonum, the coming of the Saxons. This was not a single invasion, but the beginning of a violent shift in power. The Germanic warriors, possessing intimate knowledge of the island's defences and political weaknesses, began a systematic campaign of conquest. They pushed out from their enclaves on the eastern coast, establishing their own settlements and petty kingdoms. The Romano-British, caught completely off guard, were unable to mount a coordinated defence against the very soldiers they had armed and supplied. This fateful decision to invite mercenaries did not save Britain, but instead sowed the seeds of its division, initiating decades of brutal warfare that would steadily push the native British populations westwards and transform the political and ethnic map of the island forever. As the eastern lowlands of Britain succumbed to Germanic settlement, new political entities began to crystallize in the mountainous west, coalescing from the remnants of Roman military districts and native tribal territories. The kingdom of Gwynedd, destined to become the most powerful of the Welsh realms, traces its origins to a foundational event in the mid-5th century. According to the Historia Britonum, a chieftain named Gwynedd ap Eden migrated with his 8 sons from Manor Gododin, the territory of the Votadini tribe in what is now southern Scotland. They travelled south to drive out Irish raiders who had established settlements along the coast of North Wales. This foundational story, whether a literal migration or an allegorical account of a shift in power, likely reflects a late Roman military policy of relocating loyal Federate troops to secure a vulnerable region. Historically, this act established a new dynasty that supplanted local Romano-British leaders. Gwynedda's descendants, the Gwyneddian, would rule Gwynedd for nearly 9 centuries. The sub-kingdoms that formed the core of Gwynedd were traditionally named for his sons, with Ceredigion deriving its name from Ceredig and Merioned from Merion, embedding this dynastic origin into the very geography of the land. Further east, the kingdom of Powys emerged from a different context. Its heartland corresponded closely to the former Roman civitas of the Cornovii tribe. Unlike Gwynedd, Powys appears to be a more direct successor state to a Romano-British administrative unit. Its first capital was likely the old Roman city of Viriconium Cornoviorum, near modern Wroxeter, a location that placed it squarely on the front line against the advancing Saxons. The rulers of Powys claimed descent from the British warlord Vortigern, linking their legitimacy to the last vestiges of a unified British leadership. The constant pressure from the east would eventually force the kingdom's centre of power westward, away from the vulnerable plains and into the more defensible hill country, with the court later moving to Mathrafal. These nascent kingdoms were hybrids of the old and new. Their rulers adopted the title of rex, the Latin word for king, and their administrative methods retained echoes of Roman bureaucracy. However, their social structure was fundamentally Celtic, organised around kinship groups and governed by a warrior aristocracy whose power depended on military prowess and the ability to command personal loyalty. From these uncertain beginnings, Gwynedd and Powys established themselves as the dominant powers of North and Mid Wales, their rugged terrain providing a natural fortress that would enable centuries of resistance. While new powers rose in the north, the southern coastal regions of Wales witnessed the emergence of kingdoms with their own distinct origins. In the southwest, the kingdom of Dyfed took shape in the former territory of the Demeti tribe. Its formation was defined not by a legacy of Roman military command, but by significant Irish influence. Historical traditions, supported by genealogical records, claim that the kingdom's ruling dynasty was founded by the Deisi, a tribe expelled from Ireland in the late 4th or early 5th century. This was not a hostile invasion in the manner of the Saxon shore raids, but more likely a controlled settlement of allied peoples, perhaps initially sanctioned by late Roman authorities to act as a buffer against other sea-borne threats. The most compelling evidence for this bicultural foundation comes from a unique collection of memorial stones scattered across the region. These stones bear inscriptions carved in Ogham, an early Irish alphabet, alongside Latin script. This linguistic duality indicates the presence of a ruling elite that was both Irish-speaking and integrated into the broader Romano-British world, comfortable using the language of empire and the script of their ancestral homeland. This Irish connection gave Dyfed a unique maritime character, its politics and culture oriented as much towards the Irish Sea as towards the rest of Britain. To the east, in the fertile lands between the rivers Tywee and Wye, the kingdom of Llywelyn formed. This region, corresponding to the Roman civitas of the Silures, had a much stronger and more civilian Roman legacy than the far west. Its kings, such as Muirig ap Tudrig, established a dynasty that claimed legitimacy through a different channel, a supposed lineage tracing back to the Roman usurper emperor Magnus Maximus. While historically tenuous, this claim was a powerful piece of political propaganda, asserting a direct inheritance of Roman authority. The kingdom was a patchwork of smaller cantrefai or sub-kingdoms, including Gwent in the east, which retained a separate identity for centuries. Unlike the Irish-influenced Dyfed, Llywelyn's character was more deeply rooted in the Romano-British past, its rulers patrons of the established Christian church and its society reflecting a more settled, agricultural base inherited from the villa estates of the Roman period. These southern realms, therefore, did not arise from a single mould, but were shaped by different forces, Dyfed by a fusion of Celtic, British, and Irish Gaelic cultures, and Llywelyn by a conscious effort to preserve and adapt the administrative and cultural remnants of Romanitas. The Christian faith that survived in post-Roman Wales evolved a character distinct from the structured diocesan system of the late Empire. As urban centres declined, the bishop-led, city-based model of church governance gave way to a new spiritual framework centred on monasticism. This was the Age of Saints, a period defined not by a centrally organised church, but by the influence of charismatic ascetic founders and the communities they established. These monastic settlements, known in Welsh as Clasow, became the primary hubs of religious life, learning, and ecclesiastical authority. A class was typically founded by a holy man, often of noble lineage, on land granted by a local king or chieftain. Leadership of the monastery, including the role of abbot, frequently became hereditary within the founder's kin group, intertwining ecclesiastical power with the secular aristocratic structure. Figures like Saint Illtyd established a major monastic school at Llaniltud Far, which became a renowned centre for the education of secular and religious leaders. Other foundational saints, such as Cadoc at Llyncarfan and, most famously, David at St. David's, created influential communities that became the epicenters of new spiritual networks. The form of Christianity practiced was intensely ascetic, drawing inspiration from the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria, emphasizing prayer, fasting, and manual labor. This monastic movement left an indelible mark on the landscape and language. The proliferation of place names beginning with Llan, originally meaning an enclosure and later a church, followed by the name of the founding saint, maps the geographic spread of these communities across Wales. Furthermore, early Christian inscribed stones from this period, bearing Latin inscriptions and sometimes Christian symbols like the Chiro, serve as the principal archaeological evidence for this literate, Latin-speaking religious elite. This form of Christianity was not an isolated Welsh phenomenon. It was part of a dynamic, interconnected culture that spanned the Irish Sea. Missionaries and scholars travelled frequently between Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, and Brittany, sharing texts, theological ideas, and artistic styles. This maritime network created a distinct Celtic Christian tradition, differentiated from the Anglo-Saxon church developing in England, which looked more directly to Rome for its authority and organizational model. For several centuries, the Clares Monastery, not the bishop's cathedral, would remain the heart of Welsh spiritual life. The protracted conflict with the encroaching Anglo-Saxon peoples fundamentally reshaped the collective consciousness of the Britons living in the Western Peninsula. A new, overarching identity began to supersede the older loyalties to tribe and region. This was the birth of the Cymry, a term derived from the common Brythonic word combrogi, meaning fellow countrymen. Its appearance signifies a crucial psychological shift. The people of Gwynedd, Powys, and the southern realms started to see themselves not merely as inhabitants of a specific kingdom, but as members of a single people defined by a shared culture and a common struggle. This sense of unity was forged in opposition to the Germanic newcomers, whom they called Saeson, the Saxons. The loss of the eastern territories, the Lost Lands, or Llywelyn, created a shared historical trauma and a powerful sense of otherness that bound the Western Britons together. The primary vehicle for this new identity was language. As the Brythonic tongue evolved, it diverged from the related languages in Cornwall and Brittany, solidifying into what would become Old Welsh. This shared vernacular, unintelligible to the Anglo-Saxons, became a potent symbol of their distinct heritage and a medium for a common culture. Heroic poetry, celebrating British warriors who fought against the invaders, circulated across kingdom boundaries, creating a shared pantheon of heroes and a collective historical narrative of resistance. A pivotal event in this process was the Battle of Chester around the year 616, where the forces of Northumbria defeated a Welsh army. This Northumbrian victory severed the land connection between the Britons of Wales and their kinsmen in the kingdoms of the Hen Ogledd, or the Old North, in what is now northern England and southern Scotland. This geographic and political isolation was profound. Cut off from their northern brethren, the Britons in the west were forced to consolidate, their future now intrinsically tied to the mountainous peninsula that would become their permanent homeland. It was in this crucible of military pressure, territorial loss, and geographic isolation that the modern Welsh identity was born, transforming a collection of disparate British kingdoms into the nation of the Cymry. By the late 8th century, the political landscape of Britain was dominated by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, under its powerful king, Offa. In response to persistent conflict and raiding from the Welsh kingdom of Powys, Offa commissioned a monumental engineering project that would physically define the frontier between the two peoples. This was Offa's Dyke, a massive linear earthwork running for approximately 177 miles from the Dee estuary in the north to the River Wye in the south. Its construction was an unparalleled feat of logistics and manpower in pre-Viking Britain, testifying to the administrative capacity and resource-rich nature of the Mercian state. The dyke was not a continuous wall, but a deliberately constructed bank and ditch, engineered to take advantage of natural topographical features. Crucially, its ditch was consistently built on the western, or Welsh, side, with the bank piled up to the east, creating a formidable obstacle for any force attempting to move eastward out of Wales. This design confirms its primary function as a defensive and controlling barrier from the Mercian perspective. The scale of the structure, in places reaching up to 20 feet in height from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the bank, would have required a vast corvée of conscripted labour, organised and provisioned over many years. However, the dyke was more than a simple military fortification. It was a powerful political statement, a tangible demarcation of Mercian hegemony and the limit of its direct rule. Its construction likely involved negotiation as well as conflict, establishing an agreed-upon frontier in some sectors while imposing it by force in others. It functioned as a barrier to the large-scale cattle raids that were a staple of Welsh Mercian warfare, and served as a customs barrier, allowing the Mercians to control and tax cross-border trade. For the Welsh, the dyke became a profound symbol. It was the physical scar on the landscape that solidified their separation from the rest of Britain, a line that defined the western edge of Llywelyn and the eastern boundary of Cymru. While never impermeable, this earthwork institutionalized the border, hardening a fluid frontier zone into a recognized political and cultural divide that would shape the consciousness of both nations for centuries to come. The late 8th and early 9th centuries introduced a new, unpredictable threat to the Welsh kingdoms, arriving not over a fixed land border, but from the sea. The first recorded Viking raids on the Welsh coast, primarily by Danish and Norwegian longships operating out of bases in Ireland and the Isle of Man, began in earnest in the mid-800s. These were not campaigns of conquest, but swift, brutal hit and run attacks targeting accumulated wealth. The primary victims were the coastal monastic settlements, the Classo, which were unfortified centres of learning and devotion. Monasteries such as St. David's in Dyfed, Llanbadarn 4 in Ceredigion, and the communities on Anglesey were particularly vulnerable. These institutions possessed valuable portable treasures in the form of illuminated manuscripts, gilded reliquaries, and precious metalwork used in their services, ideal plunder for raiders who valued speed and mobility. The Vikings' command of the sea allowed them to strike with little warning and retreat before a significant defensive force could be mustered. This new form of warfare rendered the static, land-based defences developed against Mercia largely obsolete. The challenge was no longer about defending a linear frontier like Offa's Dyke, but about protecting a long and exposed coastline against an enemy that could appear anywhere at any time. The initial Welsh response was localised and often ineffective, but a more coordinated defence began to emerge under Rhodri ap Merfyn, later known as Rhodri Mawr or Rhodri the Great, who had united much of Wales under his rule. In 856, Rhodri achieved a significant and widely reported victory, defeating a Danish force on Anglesey and killing their leader, Gorm. This success demonstrated that organised Welsh resistance could repel the raiders. Over time, the Norse interaction with Wales evolved beyond simple raiding. They established coastal trading posts and wintering bases, Long Fuert, integrating parts of the Welsh coast into the wider Viking maritime economy of the Irish Sea. This Norse presence left a lasting legacy in the form of place names, particularly for coastal features and islands, such as Swansea from Svine's Eye or Island, Anglesey, Ongles Island, and Skoma. The Viking tide forced the Cymry to adapt militarily, fostering greater political cooperation for mutual defence and shifting strategic focus from the eastern border to the western sea lanes. The middle of the 9th century saw the rise of a ruler whose dynastic achievements would earn him the posthumous title Mawr, or the Great. Rhodri ap Merfyn inherited the throne of Gwynedd in 844, becoming the master of a kingdom already beset by pressures from both the Mercians to the east and the Norse sea raiders to the west. His reign was defined not by a campaign of internal conquest, but by an unprecedented consolidation of power through inheritance. In 855, following the death of his maternal uncle, Cingin ap Cadell of Powys, Rhodri absorbed the neighbouring eastern kingdom into his domain, likely by right of his mother, Nest. This union of Gwynedd and Powys created a formidable political entity, the largest single realm seen in Wales for generations. His influence expanded further still. Through his marriage to Angarad, the sister of King Gwugan of Saesilweg in the southwest, Rhodri secured a powerful alliance. When Gwegen drowned without an heir in 872, Rhodri was able to claim his wife's inheritance, bringing the extensive lands of Saesilweg, which encompassed Ceredigion and Ystrad Tywys, under his control. For the first time, a single monarch ruled over the majority of what is modern Wales, from the island of Anglesey down to the borders of Dyfed. This personal union of kingdoms provided the resources for a more effective two-front war. Rhodri successfully checked Mercian aggression and, as noted, achieved a celebrated victory against Danish Vikings in 856. However, this success was not permanent. Renewed Viking pressure in 877 was so intense that it forced Rhodri into temporary exile in Ireland. He returned the following year, only to meet his end. In 878, Rhodri and his son Gwynedd were killed in battle against the forces of Ceolwulf II of Mercia. His great achievement was personal and dynastic. He did not forge a unified Welsh state with a central administration. Upon his death, in accordance with Welsh custom, his extensive territories were divided among his surviving sons, with Anarod taking Gwynedd, Cadell receiving Saesylweg, and Myrddin inheriting Powys. Rhodri Mor's legacy was not a lasting political union, but the establishment of a powerful precedent and a dominant dynasty that would shape the destiny of the Cymry for the next 400 years. The death of Rhodri Mar in 878 did not give rise to a stable, unified kingdom passed to a single heir. Instead, the vast territory he had personally united was immediately subject to the fundamental principle of Welsh law and custom known as cyfran, or partible inheritance. This system dictated that a man's property, including his kingship, was to be divided among his male heirs. Consequently, the great personal union of Gwynedd, Powys, and Saesylwig was fragmented. The core kingdom of Gwynedd, along with a degree of seniority, passed to the eldest son, Anarod ap Rhodri. The southern realm of Saesylwig went to the second son, Cadell, while Powys was inherited by Myrddin. This partition was not a sign of failure, but the lawful and expected outcome, a practice deeply ingrained in the Welsh social structure to ensure all sons received a stake in their patrimony. However, it ensured that the political landscape would remain volatile. The division inevitably fostered rivalry among the brothers and their descendants, as each sought to expand their portion of the inheritance at the expense of the others. This new generation of rulers had to navigate a complex political world. Anarod, seeking to secure his position against his brothers and the ever-present threat from Mercia, initially forged an alliance with the Norse kingdom of York. This pact was short-lived, as Anarod soon found the Norse to be unreliable allies. He then pivoted dramatically, seeking the patronage of a more powerful monarch. In approximately 893, Anarod ap Rhodri travelled to the court of Alfred the Great of Wessex and made a formal submission, recognising the West Saxon king as his overlord. This act secured him a powerful external ally against his rivals, both Welsh and Norse, but it also set a precedent for English claims of suzerainty over the Welsh kingdoms. The legacy of Rhodri's division was therefore twofold. It entrenched the rule of his dynasty, the House of Aberfraw, across Wales for centuries, but it also institutionalised the political fragmentation that would prevent the emergence of a centralised Welsh state. The practice of cyfran ensured that strong regional identities were preserved, but it also guaranteed a future of internal conflict, where the primary political ambition of many Welsh princes was not independence from England, but supremacy over their own kin. In the first half of the 10th century, a ruler emerged who would attempt to unify the Cymry not through continuous warfare, but through policy and law. Llywelyn ap Cadell, a grandson of Rhodri Mar, initially ruled the southern kingdom of Saesylwag. Through a strategic marriage to Llywelyn of Dyfed, he united the two southern realms into a new, larger kingdom known as Deheubarth around the year 920. Following the death of his cousin, Llywelyn Fool of Gwynedd, in 942, Llywelyn extended his authority north, taking control of Gwynedd and Powys. For a brief period, he became the effective ruler of all of Wales, with the exception of the small southeastern kingdoms of Morgan-wg and Gwent. Llywelyn's reign was distinguished by his pragmatic and consistently peaceful relationship with the English crown. Unlike his predecessors, he made no attempt to forge alliances against Wessex. Instead, he regularly attended the court of King Athelstan, where he witnessed English charters, tacitly acknowledging the English king's primacy. This policy of conciliation had practical benefits. Llywelyn was the only Welsh king ever permitted to mint his own currency, producing silver pennies at the English mint in Chester that bore his name, an act that symbolised his special status. His most enduring legacy, however, was the codification of Welsh law. Tradition holds that around 945, Llywelyn summoned a great assembly to Whitland in Dyfed. This council, composed of 6 eminent men from each cantref in his domain, both clerical and lay, was tasked with a monumental project: to examine, revise, and compile the disparate legal customs of the Welsh into a single standardised legal code. The goal was not to invent new laws, but to bring order to the ancient, orally transmitted traditions. The resulting body of law, Cyfraith Hywel, was exceptionally detailed, focusing on the concepts of compensation and status. It prescribed the galanas a payment for homicide, akin to the Germanic wergild, and sarhide, a payment for insult or injury, with values meticulously calculated based on a person's social standing. The laws also granted women property rights and protections that were notably progressive for the era. Although Hywel's political union fractured upon his death in 950, the legal framework he established became a cornerstone of Welsh identity, remaining in use for over 3 centuries. This achievement earned him the unique epithet Didar the Good. The legal code known as Cyfraith Hywel provides an unparalleled insight into the social structure and values of 10th century Wales. It was not a system based on punishment, but on the principle of restitution. Its primary goal was to prevent blood feuds by ensuring that every wrong had a specific, calculated monetary value for compensation. The entire framework rested on the concepts of sarhide, a payment for insult or injury, and galanas, the payment for a killing. The value of these payments was intrinsically tied to an individual's status, creating a detailed map of the social hierarchy. A king's galanas was immense, reflecting his importance to the entire community, while that of a bonhedra, a free landowner, was significantly less, and a teog, or serf, was valued lower still. This meticulous valuation extended to every aspect of life. The laws detail the worth of property with a remarkable focus on practical utility. For instance, the value of a cat was specified with great precision. A kitten from birth until it opened its eyes was worth 1 penny. From that point, until it killed its first mouse, 2 pence. And once it was a proven mouser, its value rose to 4 pence. This illustrates a society where an animal's worth was directly tied to its function. The laws also reveal a comparatively high status for women. While not equal to men, women possessed defined legal rights to property. Upon marriage, a woman was entitled to an agwedi, a share of the couple's communal property, the amount of which was determined by her father's status. If the marriage ended within 7 years, she was entitled to take her agwedi with her. She also received a cawil, a personal payment from her husband on the morning after the wedding night, which remained her exclusive property. The legal system itself operated through local courts, where disputes were settled not by a jury, but by a process of compurgation, where the accused had to gather a specific number of oath helpers to swear to their innocence. The law was administered by a professional class of jurists, the Ynadon, who were experts in this complex oral and later written tradition. Cyfraith Hywel was therefore more than a set of rules. It was the operating system of Welsh society, defining relationships, resolving conflicts, and preserving a social order based on status, honour, and compensation. The century following Hywel Didar's death was marked by incessant dynastic strife, yet it produced the one figure who would achieve what no other Welsh ruler had before or since, the military unification of all of Wales. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, son of Llywelyn ap Sisel, who had briefly held both Gwynedd and Deheubarth, began his ascent from a position of exile. In 1039 he challenged the ruling king of Gwynedd, Iago ab Idwal, and killed him in battle at Penceda, seizing the northern kingdom as his patrimony. This act initiated a career of relentless and calculated aggression aimed at creating a single Welsh polity under his absolute rule. From his secure base in Gwynedd, Gruffydd immediately turned his attention southwards. He systematically dismantled the power of the rival dynasty in Deheubarth, driving out its ruler, Hywel ab Edwin, in 1041. Although Hywel returned with Viking support, Gruffydd decisively defeated him at the mouth of the River Tywys in 1044. His primary rival in the south then became Gruffydd ap Rhydderch of Gwent, who managed to expel him from Deheubarth temporarily in 1045. For the next decade, the two Gruffyds engaged in a destructive struggle for control of the south. The conflict culminated in 1055, when Gruffydd ap Llywelyn killed his southern namesake in battle, and finally secured dominion over Deheubarth. Having conquered the north and south, he swiftly moved to subjugate the remaining independent territories, overrunning Morgan WG and Gwent and annexing them into his expanding kingdom. By the end of 1055, for the first time in history, one man ruled the entire territory of native Wales. His ambition was not confined by Offa's Dyke. He pursued an aggressive policy against the English, forming a crucial alliance with the exiled Earl of Mercia, Ealfgar. In 1055, their combined Welsh and Anglo-Saxon force marched into Herefordshire, defeated an English army under Earl Ralph, and comprehensively sacked the city of Hereford. This raid forced the English crown to negotiate, ceding border territories to Gruffydd. His reign represented a violent departure from the past, a rejection of internal division in favour of a single militaristic Welsh state forged by the sword. From 1055 until his death in 1063, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn achieved a political reality that had previously been a mere poetic aspiration: a single unified Wales under the authority of one king. His rule was not a loose overlordship, but a direct and often brutal assertion of power. The old royal dynasties of Deheubarth, Morgan WG, and Gwent were effectively suppressed, their territories administered by Gruffydd's authority, and their resources funneled towards his military state. He established his primary court at Rhuddlan in the northeast, a strategic location that allowed him to dominate the Welsh interior, while simultaneously posing a direct threat to the English border. This court became the political and military centre of his new pan-Welsh kingdom. The stability of his realm was further cemented by a prestigious and politically astute marriage to Ealdgyth, the daughter of his English ally, Ealfgar, the Earl of Mercia. This union provided him with a formal link to a powerful Anglo-Saxon noble house and a degree of legitimacy within the complex politics of the English kingdom. His military activities did not cease with the unification of Wales. They simply changed their focus. With his domestic rivals eliminated, Gruffydd turned his full attention eastward. Throughout the late 1052s, his forces conducted a series of damaging raids into English territory, creating a zone of Welsh dominance that extended beyond the traditional border. The English crown, weakened by internal divisions, was forced to acknowledge his power. The gains he had made along the border, particularly the territory ceded after the sack of Hereford, were consolidated. For this brief but significant period, Gruffydd was not just a Welsh king, but a major force in the politics of the entire island of Britain. The Welsh annals, specifically the Brut Vitae Wisigoen, remembered him as the head and shield and defender of the Britons, a testament to the profound psychological impact of his achievement. For 8 years, the constant threat of internal warfare that had defined Welsh political life for centuries was extinguished, replaced by the reality of a single, powerful, and aggressive Welsh kingdom. The relationship between the Welsh kingdoms and their Anglo-Saxon neighbours was a complex tapestry woven from threads of endemic violence and pragmatic diplomacy. The frontier, later known as the Welsh Marches, was not a static line, but a fluid zone of interaction. Conflict was a constant, but it rarely took the form of sustained campaigns of conquest. Instead, it was characterised by the Pryd, the cattle raid, a fundamental aspect of Welsh princely life. These were not mere acts of theft, but established military operations designed to acquire wealth, demonstrate martial prowess, and weaken rivals. A successful prince was expected to lead his tolu, his personal warband, on regular raids into both English territory and the lands of other Welsh rulers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle frequently records these Welsh incursions, noting the destruction they caused in border shires like Herefordshire and Shropshire. Yet, this persistent conflict did not preclude periods of coexistence or even alliance. The political landscape was fragmented on both sides of the border, and a Welsh prince might find common cause with an English earl against a mutual enemy. The most notable example remains Gruffydd ap Llywelyn's alliance with the exiled Mercian Earl Ealfgar, a partnership that allowed Welsh military power to directly influence English internal politics. Conversely, English power often projected westward through demands for tribute and formal submission. In the 10th century, powerful West Saxon kings like Athelstan asserted their overlordship over the Welsh rulers. Historical records, such as William of Malmesbury's account, describe a meeting at Hereford, where Welsh kings were compelled to acknowledge Athelstan's supremacy and agree to a substantial annual tribute of gold, silver, cattle, and hunting dogs. It was also Athelstan who formally established the River Wye as the boundary for the southern Welsh kingdoms, a clear imposition of English authority. This tributary relationship was a form of political control, a means of managing the frontier without the immense cost of permanent conquest. Cultural and economic exchange also flowed across this militarized border. Welsh timber and livestock were traded for English salt and pottery. Religious figures and pilgrims moved between the Celtic monasteries of Wales and the Benedictine foundations of England, creating a network of shared Christian learning, even if theological and liturgical practices differed. The frontier was therefore a crucible, a place where Welsh and English identities were sharpened by conflict, but also shaped by necessary interaction and mutual influence. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 was a political earthquake whose tremors were immediately felt along the Welsh frontier. The Anglo-Saxon polity, with which the Welsh had maintained a long and violent but ultimately familiar relationship, was systematically dismantled. In its place arose a new and far more dangerous entity, a centralized feudal state governed by a ruthless and efficient military aristocracy. King William I, the Conqueror, recognized the Welsh border as a source of instability and approached its pacification with a novel strategy. Instead of direct royal campaigns, he established 3 powerful earldoms at key strategic points: Hereford, Shrewsbury, and Chester. He granted these territories to 3 of his most trusted and aggressive magnates: William Fitz-Osbern, Roger de Montgomery, and Hugh de Vranches, respectively. These men were created marcher lords, vested with exceptional quasi-regal powers. They possessed the right to wage war, confiscate land, build castles, and establish their own laws, largely independent of royal authority. This effectively privatized the conquest of Wales, unleashing the land hunger of the Norman aristocracy upon the Welsh kingdoms. The nature of the threat had changed irrevocably. The initial Norman advances were swift and methodical. From his base in Hereford, William Fitz-Osbern pushed west, overrunning the Welsh kingdom of Gwynedd and establishing a new castle at Chepstow, a formidable stone keep that symbolized the permanence of the Norman presence. He continued into Brycheiniog, establishing a new lordship and demonstrating the speed of the Norman military machine. To the north, Roger de Montgomery advanced from Shrewsbury, pushing deep into Powys and building the castle at Montgomery, named after his family's home in Normandy. The primary tool of this conquest was the Motte and Bailey Castle, an earth and timber fortification that could be erected in a matter of weeks. These castles were not merely defensive strongholds, but instruments of occupation and administration, garrisoned bases from which Norman knights could dominate the surrounding countryside and enforce their authority. This was a new form of warfare, one based not on raiding and tribute, but on permanent territorial seizure and colonization. The Norman conquest replaced a fractious neighbour with a relentlessly expansionist power, initiating a century of brutal warfare that would reshape the political map of Wales forever. The power of the Marcher Lords was a unique political phenomenon, a constitutional anomaly forged in the crucible of conquest. Their lordships were not simply English shires extended westward, they were private palatinates, where the king's writ did not run. Within their domains, these barons exercised jura regalia, or royal rights, holding their own courts, appointing their own sheriffs, and waging war as sovereign princes. This extraordinary autonomy was a deliberate policy, designed to incentivize the difficult and dangerous work of subjugating the Welsh. Following the initial wave of conquest, the Marcher Lords began a process of consolidation, transforming their military gains into permanent heritable estates. The primary instrument of this consolidation was the evolution of the castle, The hastily erected motte and bailey fortifications of the first generation gave way to imposing structures of stone. This transition was a statement of intent, a declaration that the Norman presence was not temporary. Stone keeps and curtain walls were immensely expensive and required years of labour, representing a capital investment that signified permanent occupation. Chepstow Castle, founded by William Fitzosborne, saw the construction of its great tower, one of the earliest stone keeps in Britain, a clear symbol of enduring Norman authority. Similarly, castles at Ludlow, Cardiff and Pembroke were rebuilt in stone, each commanding a strategic location. These fortresses were complex military and administrative machines. Militarily, they provided secure garrisons for Norman knights and their retinues, allowing a small number of professional soldiers to dominate a much larger, and often hostile, Welsh population. They were cited to control river crossings, key roads, and fertile agricultural lands, effectively imposing a military grid upon the Welsh landscape. Administratively, the castle became the caput, or head, of the lordship. It was from the castle hall that the Marcher Lord dispensed justice, not according to the native Welsh laws of Hywel, but by the feudal customs of Normandy. It was here that revenues were collected, land grants were issued to loyal followers, and new boroughs were planned, often established in the shadow of the castle walls to encourage Norman and English settlement. This network of stone castles fundamentally altered the nature of the frontier, creating a heavily militarized and administratively distinct region, the Welsh Marches, where the power of individual lords often eclipsed that of the distant English king. With the Marcher lordships firmly established as forward bases, the Norman offensive transitioned from border consolidation to a full-scale invasion of Wales. The advance was not a single coordinated royal campaign, but a pincer movement, driven by the individual ambitions of the Marcher barons. In the south, the fertile kingdom of Morgan W.G., modern Glamorgan, was overrun by Robert Fitzhamon, Lord of Gloucester. By 1093 he had killed the Welsh king Ystyn ap Grugant and seized control of the coastal plain, establishing his principal castle at Cardiff. This conquest was brutally effective, supplanting the native Welsh rulers with a new Norman aristocracy who owed allegiance only to Fitzhamon. To the west, the kingdom of Deheubarth effectively disintegrated under the pressure. Norman adventurers pushed into its territories, with Arnulf of Montgomery carving out a new lordship for himself in Dyfed and establishing a formidable castle at Pembroke. This southern advance was characterized by the seizure of the most agriculturally productive lowlands, pushing Welsh resistance into the hill country and creating a landscape of Norman-held valleys and Welsh-controlled uplands. Simultaneously, a parallel invasion was launched in the north. Hugh d'Avranches, the Earl of Chester, in concert with Roger de Montgomery of Shrewsbury, pushed westwards with overwhelming force. Their forces swept across the north coast, building a line of motte and bailey castles to secure their advance. The kingdom of Powys was truncated, and by 1090 the Normans had overrun Gwynedd, the heartland of Welsh resistance. They built castles at key strategic locations, including a fortification at Carnarvon, directly opposite the Welsh royal seat on Anglesey. For a brief period, the Norman conquest of Wales seemed almost complete. Welsh political authority had collapsed in both the southeast and the northwest. The native dynasties were either slain, in exile, or reduced to fugitives in their own lands. The Norman tide had not just lapped at the borders, it had flooded the interior, and by the final decade of the 11th century, the independent Welsh kingdoms appeared to be on the verge of total extinction. The near-total Norman success was met not with acquiescence, but with a fierce and widespread backlash, catalysed by the return of a figure from the ancient royal line of Gwynedd. Gruffydd ap Cynan, born and raised in exile in the Hiberno-Norse kingdom of Dublin, embodied a new form of Welsh leadership. His parentage, a Welsh prince and a Norse-Irish princess, gave him access to military resources outside the traditional Welsh system. He did not rely on the native Welsh levy, the Tolu, but on professional, battle-hardened Hiberno-Norse mercenaries, paid soldiers who fought for plunder and land. His first attempt to reclaim his ancestral kingdom of Gwynedd in 1075 was a brief success, followed by a swift defeat at the hands of Norman-backed Welsh rivals, highlighting the persistent internal fragmentation that plagued Welsh resistance. After a period of further exile, Gruffydd was captured through treachery by the Earl of Chester and imprisoned for over a decade. His eventual escape coincided with a major turning point. In 1094, a spontaneous and widespread rebellion erupted across Wales, known as the Great Revolt. This was not a centrally commanded campaign, but a popular uprising fueled by resentment of Norman oppression. The Welsh captured Norman castles, massacred garrisons, and reclaimed vast territories in Gwynedd, Ceredigion, and parts of Dyfed. Gruffydd ap Cynan, along with Cadwyn ap Bleddyn of Powys, became a leading figure in this resurgence. The revolt was so successful that it forced a direct royal intervention from King William Rufus of England, whose subsequent campaigns into Wales in 1095 and 1097 achieved very little against the Welsh guerrilla tactics. The Normans were effectively pushed back to their core lordships in the south and the borderlands. The revolt demonstrated that the initial Norman conquest had been a superficial one, failing to break the will of the Welsh population. For Gruffydd ap Cynan, it provided the opportunity to firmly establish himself. He abandoned his reliance on foreign troops, secured the loyalty of the native aristocracy of Gwynedd, and began the slow, methodical process of rebuilding his kingdom from his secure heartland in Snowdonia. The resurgence of 1094 shattered the illusion of a completed conquest and initiated a new, prolonged phase of the conflict. The foundation of a consolidated Gwynedd, rebuilt by Gruffydd ap Cynan, passed to his son Owain Gwynedd upon his death in 1137. Owain inherited not just a kingdom, but a strategy, and he proved to be a master of its execution. His long reign was defined by his astute exploitation of English political instability. For nearly 2 decades, England was consumed by the civil war between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda, a period known as the Anarchy. This internal conflict paralysed the English crown's ability to project power into Wales, creating a power vacuum that Owain systematically filled. He immediately pushed eastwards, capturing the castles of Mold and Rhuddlan and securing a firm grip over the territories of Tegeingal. In a significant alliance with the princes of Deheubarth, he drove the Marcher lords out of the kingdom of Ceredigion, restoring the territory to Welsh control for the first time in a generation. When a powerful and determined monarch, Henry II, finally ascended the English throne in 1154, the situation changed dramatically. Henry was committed to restoring the borders of his grandfather's reign and launched a massive invasion of Gwynedd in 1157. This campaign, however, nearly ended in disaster for the English king when he was ambushed at the Battle of Llywelyn. Though Owain was ultimately forced to pay homage, it was a hollow victory for Henry. The true test came in 1165, when Henry launched an even larger invasion. In response, Owain achieved a remarkable diplomatic feat, assembling a grand pan-Welsh coalition of nearly every native ruler, including his great rival from the south, Rhys ap Gruffydd. This united Welsh army met Henry's forces in the Berwyn Mountains. The English campaign collapsed not in a single pitched battle, but against a combination of torrential rain, impassable terrain, and relentless Welsh guerrilla attacks. Henry's army retreated in humiliation. In the wake of this triumph, Owain Gwynedd took a radical political step. In his correspondence with King Louis VII of France, he styled himself Princeps Wallensium, Prince of the Welsh. This was a deliberate and sophisticated claim, not to be a king over other Welsh kings, but to be the preeminent leader of a confederation of Welsh lordships. It was the birth of a new political concept, the Principality of Wales, with Owain Gwynedd as its undisputed head. The prolonged survival of the Welsh principalities against a technologically and numerically superior Anglo-Norman force was not an accident of history, but the result of a highly developed and specialised military doctrine. Unable to compete with the Normans in open battle or siege warfare, the Welsh elevated their own landscape into their primary strategic weapon. The military system they perfected was a direct response to the Norman model of heavy cavalry, fortified castles, and decisive pitched battles. Welsh armies were composed differently. At their core was the teulu, the prince's household retinue, a small body of professional, well-equipped warriors bound by personal loyalty. The bulk of any force, however, was the leu, a general levy of freemen, lightly armed with spears and bows, who were not a standing army but a militia with intimate knowledge of their local terrain. Their strategy was one of avoidance and attrition. Large-scale English invasions were rarely met head-on. Instead, the Welsh would retreat into the mountainous interior of regions like Snowdonia, a natural fortress known as Eryri. They practiced a scorched earth policy, driving their livestock into the hills and destroying any food supplies, denying the slow-moving, heavily armoured Norman armies the ability to forage and sustain themselves. The core of Welsh tactics was the ambush, known as a Sinelwyn. Invading forces would be channeled into narrow passes, wooded valleys, or across difficult river fords where they could not deploy their cavalry effectively. From the high ground, the Welsh would rain down arrows and javelins, then launch swift, brutal charges before melting back into the landscape. This was complemented by the rise, or raid, a rapid strike against Norman supply lines, isolated patrols, or marcher settlements, designed to inflict casualties and gather resources before a response could be mounted. A key development during this period was the Welsh longbow. While not a Welsh invention, its use was perfected by Welsh archers, particularly those from the southern marches. Made from a single stave of yew, it was a powerful weapon capable of piercing mail armour at range, a skill that made Welsh archers highly sought-after mercenaries in later English armies. This form of warfare was fundamentally asymmetrical. It frustrated English and Norman commanders who sought a single, decisive engagement to end a campaign. The Welsh refused to offer one, preferring to let the terrain, the weather, and starvation do the work of an army. This military art, born of necessity, allowed a divided and resource-poor nation to resist conquest for over 2 centuries. While Owain Gwynedd consolidated his authority in the north, a parallel and equally significant consolidation of power was underway in the southern kingdom of Deheubarth. This resurgence was engineered by Rhys ap Gruffudd, grandson of the last independent king of the south, who would become known to history as the Lord Rhys. His early life was a relentless military campaign, fighting alongside his older brothers to reclaim ancestral lands from the dense network of marcher lordships that had fragmented the kingdom. Upon becoming the sole ruler in 1155, Rhys continued this war of reconquest, capturing key Norman castles and re-establishing a cohesive Welsh polity in the southwest. The accession of Henry II in England brought a dramatic shift in his fortunes, as the formidable Plantagenet king forced Rhys into submission. However, following Henry's failed invasion of 1165 and the rise of Owain Gwynedd as the leader of a Welsh confederation, Rhys seized the opportunity to act. He captured the strategic royal castle at Cardigan, a symbol of Norman power in the region, and systematically dismantled the surrounding lordships. After Owain Gwynedd's death in 1170, Rhys ap Gruffudd became the undisputed senior Welsh ruler. Recognizing this new reality, Henry II initiated a radical change in policy. Instead of conflict, the English king sought an accord. At a meeting in 1171, Henry confirmed Rhys in possession of all his recent conquests. More significantly, he appointed Rhys as the royal justiciar for all of South Wales. This unprecedented title made the Welsh prince the official representative of the English crown in the region, responsible for administering justice among both Welsh and Norman populations. This unique status, a blend of native Welsh authority and delegated royal power, gave him the unique epithet of the Lord Rises. He cemented his position not just through war and diplomacy, but through cultural patronage, famously hosting a grand gathering of bards and musicians at his rebuilt stone castle in Cardigan in 1176. an event often considered the first recorded Eisteddfod. His death in 1197, however, triggered the familiar pattern of dynastic strife, as his kingdom was fractured by the competing claims of his numerous sons, ensuring that the southern power he had so carefully constructed would not long outlive him. The unprecedented stability secured by Rhys ap Gruffudd, born from his dual role as Welsh prince and royal justiciar, cultivated an environment where cultural patronage could flourish. With the borders largely secure and the internal politics of Deheubarth consolidated, his court at Dynefrw became the primary centre of a Welsh renaissance. This was not a revival of a lost tradition, but an intense flourishing of existing ones, elevated by a ruler who understood that cultural power was a vital component of political authority. The court attracted the most accomplished poets, or beard, from across Wales, who competed for the prince's patronage. The strict hierarchy of the bardic order was in full effect, with the pensard, or chief poet, holding a position of immense prestige, his status in law equivalent to that of the prince's own steward. These poets, masters of the complex metrical rules known as Gwynedd, composed intricate odes of praise, not just to the Lord Rhys, but to God and to the beauty of the Welsh landscape, solidifying a national literary consciousness. It was during this period that continental European influences, particularly the tales of romance and chivalry, began to permeate Welsh literature. Native Welsh prose tales, the Mabinogion, were refined and transcribed in monastic scriptoria, with stories like Culhwch and Olwen capturing a uniquely Welsh mythological worldview. The Lord Rhys's court became a nexus where these native traditions met new European ideas, creating a vibrant and dynamic literary scene. The famous gathering at Cardigan Castle in 1176 was the public culmination of this cultural project. By inviting poets and musicians from all over Wales to compete for two chaired prizes, one for poetry and one for music, Rhys was not merely hosting a festival. He was institutionalizing the bardic tradition, providing a national stage for artistic excellence, and reinforcing his position as the preeminent patron of Welsh culture. This era also saw the significant endowment of religious houses, particularly the Cistercian Abbey of Strata Florida. Under Rhys's patronage, it became a major centre of learning and manuscript production, as well as the chosen mausoleum for his dynasty. Here monks compiled the Brut y Tywysogion, the Chronicle of the Princes, ensuring that the history of the Welsh rulers was recorded from a Welsh perspective. This period under the Lord Rhys was a deliberate and successful project of nation-building through culture, establishing a golden age in the south that demonstrated a Welsh principality could be defined as much by its poetry and learning as by its military prowess. The cultural flourishing under the Lord Rhys found its most public and historically significant expression in the year 1176. At his newly rebuilt stone castle in Cardigan, Rhys ap Gruffudd proclaimed a grand festival, sending invitations throughout Wales, and even to England, Ireland, and Scotland for a great gathering of poets and musicians. This event, while rooted in the long-standing Welsh tradition of bardic performance, was a landmark moment for its scale, its formal structure, and its profound political symbolism. This was not merely a court entertainment, it was the first recorded contest of its kind, a national assembly designed to institutionalise and celebrate the pillars of Welsh high culture. The competition was divided into two distinct disciplines, each with its own coveted prize, a chair. One chair was for the master of Syrd Dafod, the craft of the tongue, which was the intricate art of strict metre Welsh poetry. The other was for the master of Syrd Dant, the craft of the string, which encompassed instrumental music, primarily featuring the harp and the crwth. This formal division recognised the equal importance of both literary and musical artistry in Welsh society. The selection of the venue was a calculated political statement. Cardigan Castle was not an ancient Welsh court, but a formidable Norman fortress that Rhys had captured and remade. By hosting a celebration of native Welsh culture within its stone walls, he was transforming a symbol of foreign conquest into a potent symbol of Welsh authority and cultural sophistication. He was demonstrating that his power was not only martial but also cultural, capable of subduing his enemies, and then presiding over a peaceful and refined court. The chronicle Brut White Iwisogion records that Rhys bestowed great honour upon the victors, rewarding them with lavish gifts in addition to the prestigious chairs. This act of public patronage reinforced his status as the preeminent Welsh ruler, the rightful heir to a tradition of princely support for the arts. The 1176 Eisteddfod at Cardigan set a powerful precedent. It established a competitive, national framework for the bardic arts, moving them from the exclusive patronage of individual courts onto a pan-Welsh stage. It solidified the link between artistic excellence and national identity, creating a model for cultural celebration that would be emulated and revived centuries later, ensuring the survival of the very traditions the Lord Rhys sought to champion. The Golden Ages under rulers like Owain Gwynedd and the Lord Rhys were exceptions to the prevailing political reality in medieval Wales, a reality defined not by unity but by endemic internal conflict. The single greatest obstacle to a permanent, consolidated Welsh state was a deeply ingrained structural flaw within its own system of governance, the custom of partible inheritance. According to Welsh law, known as Cyfran, a ruler's lands were to be divided among all his legitimate and, often, illegitimate sons. This practice, while equitable in principle, was politically catastrophic. Upon the death of a strong prince who had successfully unified a large territory, his kingdom would immediately be fractured into smaller, competing lordships. The very success of one generation guaranteed the strife of the next. This legal framework ensured that Welsh politics was a relentless cycle of consolidation and fragmentation, a constant struggle for supremacy not against the external English threat, but against brothers, cousins, and nephews. The decades following the deaths of Owain Gwynedd in 1170 and the Lord Rhys in 1197 are the prime illustrations of this destructive pattern. The powerful principality of Gwynedd, so carefully unified by Owain, dissolved into a bitter civil war between his numerous sons, each carving out a piece of the inheritance and battling for ultimate control. Similarly, the great southern realm of Deheubarth, which Rhys had made the dominant power in Wales, was shattered by the warring ambitions of his heirs. This perpetual infighting consumed Welsh resources, manpower, and strategic focus. Instead of presenting a united front against the encroaching Marcher lords, Welsh princes frequently sought alliances with them, or even with the English king himself, to gain an advantage over a domestic rival. The English crown and the Marcher lords became masters at exploiting these divisions. Their policy was one of systematic divide and rule, offering military support or political recognition to one Welsh claimant in exchange for homage and concessions, only to later support a rival to keep the region destabilized. Welsh princes were often forced into the humiliating position of appealing to the King of England to arbitrate their own dynastic disputes, an act that implicitly acknowledged English overlordship and further eroded Welsh sovereignty. This fractured resistance meant that Welsh power was in a constant state of flux, preventing the development of stable, long-term institutions of statehood, and ensuring that any unity achieved by a great leader was tragically ephemeral. Into the political vacuum and incessant strife created by the custom of partible inheritance, a new figure emerged at the close of the 12th century. Llywelyn ab Iorwerth, a grandson of the great Owain Gwynedd, was born into a fragmented Gwynedd, a kingdom torn apart by the rivalries of his uncles. Possessing a formidable claim but no actual power, the young Llywelyn began his career as an exiled warlord with a small band of followers, embarking on a systematic campaign to reclaim his patrimony. Between 1194 and 1202, he demonstrated a military and strategic prowess that far exceeded his rivals. He defeated his uncle Dafydd ab Owain at the Battle of Aberconwy, and later imprisoned his cousin, methodically eliminating every other claimant until he was the sole undisputed master of Gwynedd. His consolidation of power was not merely a military exercise, it was a direct challenge to the legal tradition of Cyfran that had perpetually weakened Wales. Having secured his home territory, Llywelyn displayed a political astuteness that would define his long reign. He understood that Welsh power could not exist in isolation from the English crown. In 1205, he executed his most significant diplomatic manoeuvre by marrying Joan, the illegitimate daughter of King John of England. This marriage was a masterstroke of statecraft. It provided him with a direct and intimate link to the English court, affording him a degree of protection from the aggressions of both the Marcher lords and the king himself. It transformed his status from that of a troublesome Welsh prince to the king's own son-in-law, a position he leveraged with consummate skill. With Gwynedd unified and his English flank partially secured through marriage, Llywelyn began to extend his hegemony over the rest of Wales. He intervened in the succession disputes of Powys and took advantage of the weakness in Deheubarth to annex territory. He compelled other Welsh rulers to pay him homage, acting not as a mere overlord, but as a suzerain, the primary political authority in native Wales. This period marked the beginning of a 40-year dominance, in which Llywelyn ab Iorwerth would use a combination of ruthless military force, strategic patience, and shrewd diplomacy to forge a Principality of Wales in all but name. With Gwynedd secured, Llywelyn ab Iorwerth's strategy evolved from reclamation to consolidation, a process marked by calculated political opportunism. His greatest advantage came from the internal turmoil consuming the English kingdom. As King John became embroiled in a bitter conflict with his own barons, a struggle that would culminate in the Magna Carta of 1215, Llywelyn seized the moment. He allied himself with the rebellious English barons, launching a series of devastatingly effective military campaigns between 1212 and 1215. Marching his forces south, he systematically dismantled years of Norman gains, capturing the crucial royal castles at Carmarthen and Cardigan, and asserting his dominance over the fractured southern principalities. This military success was the prelude to his most significant political achievement. In 1216, Llywelyn convened a council of nearly all the native Welsh rulers at Aberdyfi. This was not a council of equals, but a demonstration of his newfound supremacy. He presided over the assembly not as a mere first among equals, but as the undisputed suzerain of native Wales. There, he sat in judgment over the bitter inheritance disputes that had torn apart the southern realm of Deheubarth, partitioning its lands among the rival claimants as he saw fit. This single act fundamentally altered the political structure of Wales, subordinating the authority of other princes to his own, and establishing a principle of feudal overlordship previously unknown among the Welsh. Following King John's death, Llywelyn shrewdly made peace with the new minority government of Henry III. The resulting Treaty of Worcester in 1218 was a diplomatic triumph. The English crown formally recognised Llywelyn's recent conquests, and his de facto authority over the Welsh lords who had paid him homage, in exchange for his own homage to the English king. Internally, Llywelyn began to buttress his power with the tools of the state. He initiated a programme of building stone castles, such as Criccieth, which were not just military strongholds but centres of administration. He adopted Anglo-Norman governmental practices, issuing charters and developing a more structured fiscal system, consciously moving away from the itinerant model of earlier Welsh courts. Through this masterful blend of warfare, diplomacy, and administrative reform, Llywelyn laid the practical foundations for a unified Welsh state. Llywelyn ab Iorwerth's relationship with the English crown was the central and most volatile element of his political career, a high-stakes game of diplomacy and war defined by his personal connection to the mercurial King John. The marriage to Joan was an instrument of statecraft, yet it did not guarantee Llywelyn's security. This became terrifyingly apparent in 1211 when King John, temporarily free from his baronial troubles, launched a massive and successful invasion of Gwynedd. The English king marched his forces to the foot of Snowdonia, forcing a humiliating submission from his son-in-law. Llywelyn was compelled to cede the eastern territories of Gwynedd, known as the Four Cantrefs, and to hand over his only legitimate son, Gruffydd, as a hostage. This campaign brought Llywelyn to the brink of total political ruin, and demonstrated the immense military power the English crown could wield when focused. However, John's success was short-lived. His tyranny and fiscal demands soon pushed his own barons into open revolt, plunging England into the civil war that would lead to Magna Carta. It was this internal English chaos that Llywelyn, with the shrewdness of a master strategist, identified as his moment of opportunity. In a calculated act of political defiance, he abandoned his allegiance to his father-in-law and formally allied himself with the rebellious English barons. This was a significant gamble, siding with a fractured rebellion against an established, albeit weakened, monarch. Throughout 1212, Llywelyn forged a pan-Welsh coalition, methodically leading his forces to reclaim the territories he had lost. His campaign was not a series of disconnected raids, but a systematic reconquest. The English distraction allowed him to operate with a freedom he had never before possessed, capturing key royal and marcher strongholds across Wales. He even briefly seized the strategically vital English town of Shrewsbury in 1215, demonstrating that his military reach now extended beyond the traditional Welsh border. By skillfully playing the factions of a divided England against one another, Llywelyn transformed his near annihilation into absolute supremacy. His alliance with the ultimately victorious barons ensured that when peace was made, his gains would have to be recognised, cementing his position as the unchallengeable power in Wales. Llywelyn ab Iorwerth's military alliance with the English barons elevated him from a regional power to a pivotal figure in the constitutional crisis of the English realm. His successful campaigns had made him an indispensable partner to the rebellion, granting him a place at the negotiating table for what would become Magna Carta in 1215. While not physically present at Runnymede, his interests were powerfully represented, and his military pressure was a key factor, forcing King John to concede to the Charter's terms. The resulting document was not merely an English affair. It contained specific clauses that directly addressed the political and legal status of Wales, a testament to Llywelyn's extraordinary influence. Clause 56 of the Great Charter was a monumental achievement for the Welsh prince. It stipulated that disputes over lands held in Wales were to be judged according to Welsh law, a formal acknowledgement by the English crown of the legitimacy and authority of the native legal system, the laws of Hywel Dda. This was an unprecedented concession, placing Welsh law on an equal footing with English and marcher law within the Charter's framework, and validating Llywelyn's long-term goal of establishing a distinct Welsh polity. Furthermore, Clause 57 directly addressed a personal and political grievance, demanding the immediate return of all Welsh hostages, most notably Llywelyn's own son and heir Gruffydd, who had been in John's custody since the disastrous invasion of 1211. Another clause ensured the restoration of Welsh liberties and the return of charters seized by the king. For Llywelyn, Magna Carta was more than a list of baronial grievances. It was a constitutional recognition of his status and the unique legal identity of the lands under his control. His ability to embed these Welsh-specific articles into the most significant legal document of the age marked the absolute zenith of his political power, transforming him into a statesman on a British, and indeed European, stage. With the death of King John in 1216 and the accession of the 9-year-old Henry III, the political landscape of England was transformed. The kingdom was now governed by a regency council, led by the pragmatic and respected William Marshal, whose primary objective was to restore stability after the chaos of the First Barons' War. This internal English preoccupation created a diplomatic opening that Llywelyn ab Iorwerth was uniquely positioned to exploit. His military victories and the submission of the other Welsh lords at Aberdeenshire had made him the master of Wales. But this supremacy lacked formal legal recognition from the English crown. To secure his gains for the long term, Llywelyn transitioned from warrior to diplomat, seeking a permanent settlement. The negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Worcester in 1218, a document that fundamentally redefined the political relationship between England and Wales. Under the terms of the treaty, Llywelyn performed homage to the young Henry III, a conventional act of feudal submission. However, The concessions he received in return were anything but conventional. The English crown formally confirmed his possession of all his recent conquests, most importantly, the strategic southern castles of Carmarthen and Cardigan. More significantly, the treaty implicitly acknowledged his authority over the other Welsh rulers. The agreement stipulated that the native princes who had paid homage to Llywelyn would continue to hold their lands under his overlordship. This clause was revolutionary. For the first time, the English government officially recognised a single Welsh ruler as the feudal superior of the other native lords. The Treaty of Worcester effectively sanctioned the creation of a distinct Welsh principality, a cohesive political entity with Llywelyn at its head, existing as a vassal state within the broader Angevin political system. It was a monumental diplomatic victory, achieved without bloodshed, that legitimised Llywelyn's military achievements and provided the legal foundation for the unified Welsh state he had spent decades building. Having secured his principality through war and treaty, Llywelyn ab Iorwerth turned his attention to the immense challenge of governance. His great innovation was not the replacement of Welsh tradition, but its fusion with the most effective administrative tools of his Angevin rivals. He did not seek to impose a foreign system, but to build a modern, resilient Welsh state upon its native foundations. The bedrock of his principality remained the ancient legal system, Cyfraith Hywel. This body of native law continued to govern inheritance, social status, and criminal compensation among his Welsh subjects, ensuring a sense of legal and cultural continuity. Llywelyn, however, began to adapt and formalise its application. He presided over a supreme legal court for his principality, acting as the final arbiter in disputes between his vassal lords, thereby reinforcing his position as the single font of justice in native Wales. Upon this traditional base, Llywelyn grafted the most effective aspects of Anglo-Norman administration. He was one of the first Welsh rulers to make extensive use of written charters to grant land and privileges, particularly to the influential Cistercian monasteries which acted as key centres of his administration. These documents, written in Latin and sealed in the manner of the English Chancery, created permanent, legally binding records that moved beyond the traditional reliance on oral testimony and memory. He established a more formalised central treasury to manage the principality's revenues, collecting feudal dues, court fines, and customs from trade. His court ceased to be merely a travelling household of warriors and became a sophisticated administrative centre, populated by a growing number of clerks and officials, such as the Chancellor and Steward, who implemented the prince's will through a nascent bureaucracy. Llywelyn also reshaped the political structure of Wales by adapting feudal concepts to a Welsh context. He demanded and received public acts of homage and fealty from the other Welsh lords, transforming them from temporary allies into sworn vassals who held their lands from him. This created a clear and defensible political hierarchy, a structure the English crown understood and had been forced to recognise. This hybrid government, blending the cultural authority of Welsh law with the administrative efficiency of the Angevin state, was Llywelyn's most profound and lasting achievement. Under Llywelyn the Great, the royal court, or Liz, ceased to be merely the itinerant headquarters of a warrior king and transformed into the fixed political and cultural nucleus of the Welsh Principality. While he maintained several residences, the ancestral court at Aberfraw on the Isle of Anglesey was elevated to a status of supreme importance, becoming the symbolic and functional capital of native Wales. This was a calculated political statement. Aberfraw was the ancient seat of the kings of Gwynedd, and by centering his power there, Llywelyn asserted his legitimacy as the inheritor of a royal tradition stretching back centuries. The court was the primary instrument of his power, a place where patronage, justice, and culture were dispensed to create a unified Welsh political class loyal to him. Central to the court's function was the formalised system of bardic patronage. The poets were not mere entertainers but essential state functionaries, integrated into the court hierarchy. At the apex was the pensyrd, or chief poet, a figure of immense prestige who was a companion to the prince and a master of the complex metrical forms of Welsh poetry. Below him were the Beard Tulu, the poets of the royal household, tasked with composing praise poems, or maul, that celebrated Llywelyn's victories, wisdom, and generosity. These compositions, performed in the great hall to the accompaniment of the harp, were a sophisticated form of political communication, reinforcing the prince's authority and broadcasting his achievements to visiting lords and dignitaries. The court at Aberfra also functioned as the supreme legal and political forum for all of native Wales. Ambitious Welshmen, from minor lords to landholding freemen, understood that the path to advancement now led directly to the prince's presence. It was here that land disputes were settled, petitions for office were heard, and fealty was sworn. By centralizing the dispensation of justice and favour, Llywelyn systematically drew power away from the regional lords and the marchers, forcing the Welsh nobility to look to him, and not to the English king or local rivals, as the ultimate source of authority and reward. This concentration of talent and ambition made the court a vibrant, competitive, and distinctly Welsh centre of power, fostering a shared political identity among the elite of the new principality. The cultural renaissance that flourished in the courts of the Welsh princes provided the fertile ground for one of the most significant literary achievements of the European Middle Ages. Beyond the formal praise poetry of the court bards, there existed a much older and deeper reservoir of native Welsh tradition, the prose tales of myth and legend. For centuries, these stories had been transmitted orally by professional storytellers known as the cipher Wyddiaid. During the politically confident and culturally assertive atmosphere of the 12th and 13th centuries, these ancient narratives were finally committed to writing, a monumental act of cultural preservation. This collection of 11 prose stories is now known as the Mabinogion. It is not the work of a single author, but rather the written crystallization of a vast and ancient oral inheritance, transcribed by anonymous scribes, most likely in monastic centres. The tales are preserved in 2 key medieval Welsh manuscripts, the White Book of Rhydderch, compiled around 1350, and the Red Book of Hergest, written shortly after 1382. At the heart of the collection are the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, tales which are not heroic epics in the classical sense, but complex narratives rooted in a distant, pre-Christian mythological past. Their protagonists, such as Pwyll, Rhiannon, and Manawydan, are best understood as euhemerized gods and goddesses from a lost Celtic pantheon. The stories themselves are intricate, weaving together themes of magic, otherworldly journeys, transformations, and the fluid boundary between the human world and the Annwn, the Welsh otherworld. Alongside the 4 branches, the collection includes other seminal works of Welsh prose, such as Culhwch and Olwen, one of the earliest and most elaborate tales of King Arthur in any language, and the 3 Welsh romances, which show the influence of French chivalric literature, but are rooted in native Welsh characters and settings. The act of writing down these stories was a profound statement of cultural identity. In a period of constant pressure from the Anglo-Norman world, committing these foundational myths to vellum was a conscious effort to define and preserve a uniquely Welsh literary and historical tradition, one that was older and entirely distinct from that of their powerful neighbours. The death of Llywelyn the Great in 1240 plunged the principality he had meticulously constructed into a period of profound uncertainty. For years, Llywelyn had laboured to overturn Welsh succession custom in favour of a more stable, primogeniture-based inheritance. He had designated his only legitimate son, Dafydd ap Llywelyn, as his sole heir, securing oaths of fealty from the other Welsh lords, and even gaining the reluctant acknowledgement of King Henry III of England. Dafydd inherited a unified Welsh state, a political entity unparalleled in Welsh history. Yet, the foundations of this new principality were immediately tested by both internal tradition and external ambition. The most significant internal threat was the existence of Dafydd's older, illegitimate half-brother, Gruffydd. A charismatic and proven military commander, Gruffydd represented the claims of native Welsh law, which made no distinction between legitimate and illegitimate sons in matters of inheritance. Llywelyn had foreseen this danger and had imprisoned Gruffudd to secure Dafydd's position. But his brother remained a potent symbol for those who resisted the new centralized model of governance. Seeing an opportunity in Llywelyn's passing, Henry III moved swiftly to dismantle the Welsh principality. He refused to recognise Dafydd's title as Prince of Wales and began treating directly with the lesser Welsh lords, encouraging them to break their oaths to Dafydd and renew their homage to the English crown. Faced with a major English invasion in 1241 and the defection of key vassals, Dafydd was forced into a humiliating submission. At the Treaty of Gwynedd, he surrendered vast territories in the east and agreed to release Gruffudd into Henry's custody. This was a masterful stroke by the English king, who now held the main Welsh counterclaimant as a political prisoner in the Tower of London, a constant threat to be used against Dafydd. Gruffudd's death in 1244, during a desperate attempt to escape from the Tower, paradoxically strengthened Dafydd's hand by removing his primary rival. This event helped to unify Welsh sentiment behind him, and he launched a widespread and successful rebellion, even seeking papal recognition for his principality as a means of escaping English overlordship. By 1245, his forces had regained significant ground, but just as the tide seemed to be turning, Dafydd died suddenly at his court in Aber in early 1246. He left no heir, leaving the principality leaderless and exposed to the full force of English royal ambition. The leaderless principality left by Dafydd ap Llywelyn was swiftly dismembered by an ascendant Henry III. The Treaty of Woodstock in 1247 formalised the collapse of Llywelyn the Great's life's work. The Welsh lords of the east and south once again did homage directly to the English king, and Gwynedd itself was partitioned. The lands east of the River Conwy were annexed by the English crown, while the heartland west of the river was left to the two eldest sons of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn, Owain Goch and his younger brother, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd. For nearly a decade, the brothers ruled this diminished inheritance jointly, a fragile power-sharing arrangement dictated by Welsh custom, but ill-suited to the singular ambition required for national recovery. The political landscape of Gwynedd during this period was one of internal tension and external submission. Owain, as the elder brother, likely held seniority, but it was the younger Llywelyn who possessed the vision and ruthless determination of his grandfather. Friction between the two was inevitable, and it came to a head in 1255. Seeking to end the division of power, Llywelyn and his youngest brother Dafydd challenged Owain for sole control of Gwynedd. The decisive conflict took place at the Battle of Bryn Derwin. It was a short, sharp, and brutal civil war, a dynastic struggle fought not against the English, but between Welshmen for the future of Wales. Llywelyn's victory was absolute. He defeated his brother's forces, capturing Owain and imprisoning him for over 2 decades. With this single act, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd shattered the tradition of partible inheritance that had so often fractured Welsh power, and established himself as the sole, undisputed master of Gwynedd Uch Conwy, the kingdom west of the Conwy. From this secure power base, he immediately began to pursue a calculated and aggressive policy of expansion. His ambition was clear and unwavering: to expel the English from the lands seized in 1247, to subordinate the other Welsh lords to his authority, and to restore the unified Principality of Wales that his grandfather had created. He was no longer just a lord of Gwynedd, he was the heir to a grand political project. Having secured his position as the sole ruler of Gwynedd, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd did not pause. In November of 1256, he launched a lightning campaign to reclaim the territories his father had lost. With astonishing speed, his forces swept eastwards, and within a single week, he had overrun Porthedward, the middle country between the Conwy and Dee rivers, expelling the English officials and reclaiming the lands annexed by the Crown after the Treaty of Woodstock. The success of this initial stroke was built on a groundswell of popular support from the local Welsh, who had chafed under English administration. This victory was merely the prelude to a much broader strategy. Llywelyn immediately turned his armies south, pushing into the territories of other Welsh lords who were vassals of the English king. He drove into Meirionnydd and then Ceredigion, rapidly bringing them under his control. The momentum of his advance was overwhelming. One by one, the native rulers of Wales were faced with a stark choice: submit to Llywelyn's authority or be swept aside. Meredith ap Rhys Grigg of Ystrad Tywys was defeated and forced to pay homage. The rulers of northern Powys soon followed. Llywelyn's campaigns were not merely raids for plunder. They were a systematic political project aimed at dismantling the network of English alliances and replacing it with a hierarchy of Welsh vassals loyal to him. The timing of his rise was aided immeasurably by the political turmoil in England, where Henry III was increasingly distracted by his mounting conflict with his own barons, a struggle that would soon erupt into civil war. This English weakness gave Llywelyn the critical space he needed to consolidate his gains without facing a full-scale royal response. The culmination of this period of military success came in 1258. At a great assembly, nearly all the native rulers of Wales, with the notable exception of Gruffudd ap Gwenwynwyn of southern Powys, gathered to formally acknowledge Llywelyn's supremacy. There, they swore fealty to him, and he formally adopted the title of Princeps Waliae, Prince of Wales. This was a direct and deliberate revival of his grandfather's ambition, a formal declaration that he was not merely the most powerful lord in Wales, but the political head of a unified Welsh nation. The Principality of Wales, dismembered only a decade earlier, had been reborn through force of arms and political will. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's assumption of the title Prince of Wales in 1258 was a unilateral declaration, an act of defiance backed by military success but not recognised by the English crown. The key to transforming this de facto reality into a legally binding fact lay in the escalating civil war in England. Llywelyn astutely allied himself with Simon de Montfort, the leader of the baronial opposition against King Henry III. This alliance, formalised in the Treaty of Pipton in 1265, was a strategic masterstroke. While the English barons fought the king, Llywelyn was free to cement his authority in Wales. He consolidated his hold over the Welsh lords, captured crucial royal and marcher castles like Dyserth and Deganwy, and expanded his influence deep into the marches. Even after de Montfort was defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham later that year, Llywelyn's position remained unassailable. The English monarchy, though victorious over its own rebels, was financially exhausted and militarily depleted, in no condition to embark upon a major war to subdue the Welsh prince. Henry III, guided by the papal legate Ottobuono, who sought stability, was compelled to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Montgomery, signed in September 1267. This document represents the absolute zenith of native Welsh political power. For the first time in history, an English king formally and legally recognised a Welsh ruler as the Prince of Wales. The treaty conceded nearly all of Llywelyn's demands. His direct control over the lands he had conquered, including Perfed Dwad, was confirmed. Furthermore, the English crown acknowledged his right to receive homage from all other native Welsh rulers, with the sole exception of Meredith ap Rhys Grigg. In return for this unprecedented recognition of a unified feudal Principality of Wales, Llywelyn agreed to pay homage to Henry III for his lands, and to make a substantial payment of 25,000 marks. The Treaty of Montgomery was not a concession granted out of goodwill. It was a political reality forced upon a weakened English king by a powerful and astute Welsh statesman. It was the legal birth certificate for the Principality of Wales, a triumph of diplomacy that legitimised 2 decades of relentless military campaigning. The title of Prince of Wales, secured by the Treaty of Montgomery, was more than a mere honorific. It was a constitutional revolution. For the first time, a native ruler held a position that was not simply based on being the most powerful warlord, but was a defined feudal and legal status acknowledged by the English crown. This elevated Llywelyn ap Gruffudd from a preeminent king among kings to the formal overlord of a consolidated Welsh polity. His authority was no longer just a matter of military dominance, but of legal right. The other Welsh lords, who had previously been vassals of the English king, now owed their allegiance and homage directly to Llywelyn. This created, in effect, a new feudal pyramid in Britain, with the Prince of Wales serving as a direct tenant-in-chief of the English king, and all other native Welsh rulers as his sub-vassals. This structure was a profound departure from traditional Welsh political systems, imposing a more rigid hierarchical model of Norman-style feudalism onto the fluid and kinship-based power structures of Wales. Llywelyn immediately began to exercise the authority his new title conferred. He acted not as a regional chieftain, but as a sovereign prince, developing a more sophisticated administration for his principality. He established a council, issued charters, and sought to create a more unified legal and financial system. One of the most tangible and provocative demonstrations of his new status was his decision to build new castles, such as the fortress at Dolfawin in the Upper Severn Valley. Castle building was a potent symbol of lordship and authority, an act traditionally reserved for the king and his most powerful marcher barons. By constructing his own stone fortress in a strategic location previously controlled by the marcher lords, Llywelyn was making a clear statement about the reality of his power and the legitimacy of his new state. For this brief period, the Principality of Wales existed as a recognised, coherent political entity on the map of Europe. Its ruler engaged in diplomacy not as a rebel, but as a recognised prince, and its borders were, for the first time, guaranteed by a formal treaty with its most powerful neighbour. The fragile peace secured by the Treaty of Montgomery was contingent on the political realities of its time, namely, the weakness of the English monarchy. That reality was shattered in 1272 with the death of Henry III and the accession of his son Edward I. The new king was a figure of a different calibre entirely. Where Henry had been vacillating and frequently undermined by his own barons, Edward was a hardened and experienced military commander, fresh from the Ninth Crusade and forged in the brutal crucible of the Second Barons' War. He was a man of immense personal authority, possessed of a formidable intellect, and driven by a precise, legalistic, and utterly uncompromising vision of royal power. Edward did not view his kingdom as a collection of disparate lordships and semi-independent principalities. He envisioned a single, unified island of Britain, with himself as the undisputed sovereign. His political project was the enforcement of his feudal suzerainty, not as a vague, theoretical claim, but as a practical, administrative reality. For Edward, the existence of a legally recognised, semi-autonomous Principality of Wales was an intolerable anomaly, a challenge to the very fabric of his royal authority. He possessed the means to enforce his will in a way his father never could. He commanded a far more unified England, with a sophisticated system of taxation and military administration capable of funding and sustaining long-term, large-scale campaign. He was a master of logistics and a pioneer of military engineering, particularly the systematic use of castle construction as a tool of conquest and occupation. The political landscape that had allowed Llywelyn ap Gruffudd to flourish had vanished. The Welsh prince, accustomed to dealing with a distracted and weakened English court, now faced a determined and ruthless monarch at the height of his powers. The conflict was inevitable, born not just of personal ambition, but of two fundamentally incompatible political visions. Edward's insistence on the absolute letter of feudal law would clash directly with Llywelyn's defence of the rights he had won by treaty. The era of negotiation and Welsh opportunism was over. An age of systematic, state-directed conquest was about to begin. The relationship between Llywelyn ap Gruffudd and the new English king was not founded on trust, but on the precise, cold calculus of feudal law. The initial test of this relationship came swiftly. Upon his return to England in 1274, Edward I, as the undisputed suzerain, issued a series of summons for Llywelyn to come to Chester to perform homage. Llywelyn, however, repeatedly refused. His refusal was not a simple act of defiance, it was a calculated political stance. Citing concerns for his personal safety and the guarantees of the Treaty of Montgomery, he argued that the king had not created a safe and neutral environment for such a meeting. This standoff became the central point of friction. To Edward, Llywelyn's repeated failure to appear was a clear case of contumacy. a willful and illegal disobedience by a vassal towards his lord. For the Welsh prince, it was the legitimate assertion of his status as a Prince of Wales, who was not to be treated as a common English baron to be summoned at will. The situation was aggravated by Llywelyn's continued policy of granting refuge to Edward's political enemies. Llywelyn's own brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, a frequent rebel, found sanctuary in Gwynedd after disputes with Llywelyn, only to later defect to the English, further complicating the political landscape. Llywelyn also maintained his alliance with the family of the late Simon de Montfort, Edward's archenemy. The final and most personal breach occurred in 1275. Llywelyn was to be married by proxy to Eleanor de Montfort, Simon's daughter, a union that would have cemented his political alliances and his dynasty. As Eleanor sailed from France to Wales, her ship was intercepted in the Bristol Channel on Edward's direct orders. The English king captured the bride-to-be and held her, essentially as a high-status prisoner, at his court. To Llywelyn, this was an act of kidnapping and a profound personal and political humiliation. To Edward, it was the justifiable seizure of the daughter of a notorious traitor who was en route to marry a recalcitrant vassal. With this act, any semblance of cautious respect vanished, replaced by open hostility. The dispute had escalated from a legal argument over feudal obligations to a direct and personal conflict, making a military confrontation all but inevitable. By November 1276, Edward I's patience had expired. Having exhausted the legal avenues of feudal summons, he secured the judgment of his court, which declared Llywelyn ap Gruffudd a rebel and a disturber of the peace. This provided the legal justification for a full-scale military campaign, not merely a punitive raid, but a war of conquest, planned with methodical precision. The invasion that commenced in the summer of 1277 was unlike any Wales had faced before. It was a testament to Edward's logistical genius and immense resources. Instead of a single royal army, he launched a coordinated, three-pronged assault. From the north, a massive force advanced from Chester, directly targeting the heartlands of Gwynedd. From the centre, another army pushed out from Montgomery to subdue the Middle March. In the south, a third force, commanded by Payne de Schaworth, advanced from Carmarthen, systematically securing the allegiance of the southern Welsh lords. This overwhelming strategy was designed to prevent the Welsh from concentrating their forces and to dismantle Llywelyn's principality piece by piece. The campaign was not defined by pitched battles, which Edward largely avoided, but by a relentless and suffocating advance. English forces methodically cleared forests to prevent ambushes and began the construction of new stone castles at key strategic points such as Flint and Rhuddlan to secure their gains. A crucial element of Edward's strategy was the seizure of the Isle of Anglesey, the agricultural heartland that supplied Gwynedd with grain. An English fleet blockaded the coast, and a force of soldiers, accompanied by a legion of woodcutters, crossed the Menai Strait to occupy the island and harvest its crops. Deprived of his allies, who quickly submitted to Edward in the face of his overwhelming power, and with his food supply cut off, Llywelyn found his position untenable. He was effectively trapped in the mountains of Snowdonia, his authority shrinking with each passing week. Facing starvation and total defeat, he was forced to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Aberconwy in November 1277 was a complete capitulation. Llywelyn was stripped of all his lands east of the River Conwy. The lesser Welsh rulers were released from their homage to him and made direct vassals of the English king once more. His grand title of Prince of Wales, won by treaty a decade earlier, was now restricted in practice to a small corner of Gwynedd. The great principality was shattered, and Welsh independence was left hanging by the barest of threads. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, was not a negotiation between equals, but the imposition of terms upon a defeated ruler. It systematically dismantled the political structure that Llywelyn ap Gruffudd and his grandfather had painstakingly built over half a century. The territorial penalties were severe and precise. Llywelyn was forced to cede all of his lands east of the River Conwy, effectively surrendering the four cantrefs, or Perfedwad, which had been the heartland of his expansion and a major source of his revenue and power. This single clause erased years of Welsh military gains and pushed the boundary of Llywelyn's direct rule back into the mountainous core of Snowdonia. His authority, once acknowledged across most of native Wales, was now geographically confined to Gwynedd Uch Conwy, the land above the Conwy. Politically, the treaty was even more devastating. The homage of almost all other native Welsh rulers was transferred directly to the English crown. The complex web of vassalage that had made Llywelyn the undisputed overlord of a unified Welsh principality was severed at a stroke. He was no longer the political head of a nation, but merely one of several major Welsh lords, all of whom now answered directly to King Edward. While he was permitted to retain the title of Prince of Wales, it was now a hollow honorific, stripped of its wider political substance. The personal humiliations were just as calculated. Llywelyn was required to pay an enormous indemnity of £50,000, a sum far beyond his means, intended to underscore his complete subjugation, even though Edward I later waived its collection. He was also compelled to provide 10 high-status hostages to guarantee his future good behaviour. In a carefully staged piece of political theatre, Llywelyn finally performed the act of homage to Edward that he had so long resisted. As a solitary concession, Edward permitted Llywelyn's marriage to Eleanor de Montfort to proceed, but this was a calculated act of magnanimity that cost the king nothing and served to bind the now diminished prince more closely to the English court. The treaty fundamentally redrew the political map of Wales, leaving a proud and once unified principality shattered and reduced to a fraction of its former self. The 5 years following the Treaty of Aberconwy were not a time of peace, but of simmering resentment under the weight of a new and alien administration. In the territories ceded to the English crown, particularly the four cantrefs, Edward I's officials began a systematic replacement of Welsh law, the Cyfraith Hywel, with English common law. This was not a minor adjustment, it was a fundamental assault on the structure of Welsh society. Welsh law, with its emphasis on community, compensation for wrongs, and partable inheritance among sons, was replaced by a system that favoured primogeniture and harsher corporal punishments. The actions of English administrators, such as the Royal Justice for Wales, Roger de Clifford, were often perceived as arrogant, corrupt, and deaf to Welsh customs. The person who felt this change most acutely was Llywelyn's own brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd. Having been an ally of Edward in the previous war, Dafydd had been rewarded with lands in the Perfedwad. However, he soon found that his authority as a Welsh lord was constantly undermined by English officials. He had exchanged the overlordship of his brother for the far more intrusive and inflexible rule of the English king. His personal grievances mirrored the wider discontent of a people pushed to their breaking point. The breaking point came on Palm Sunday, 1282. In a move of shocking audacity, Dafydd launched a surprise attack on Hawarden Castle, slaughtering its garrison. This was the spark that ignited a nationwide conflagration. Almost simultaneously, other Welsh lords rose in revolt. Aberystwyth Castle was captured, and the castles at Flint and Rhuddlan came under siege. The speed and coordination of the uprising revealed a deep well of popular support and a pre-planned desire to throw off English rule. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, now ruling a diminished Gwynedd, was caught in a difficult position. He had not instigated the rebellion, but the sheer force of the national uprising left him with no choice. To stand aside would be to cede leadership of the Welsh people and abandon the very cause his life had been dedicated to. Recognizing the gravity of the moment, Llywelyn threw his support behind his brother, transforming Dafydd's revolt into a full-scale war of national independence, the final, desperate struggle for a free Wales. In the winter of 1282, with the rebellion raging, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd made a fateful strategic decision. Leaving the defence of his Gwynedd heartland, he marched south into mid-Wales. His objective was to rally support among the lords of the Middle March and open a second front, a move intended to divide Edward I's forces and demonstrate that the uprising was a truly national effort. By early December, he had arrived in the cantref of Builth, a region controlled by the hostile Marcher lords. It was here, near the River Irfon, that the campaign and Llywelyn's life would come to an abrupt and brutal end. On the 11th of December, under circumstances that remain debated, Llywelyn became separated from the main body of his army. Historical accounts suggest he may have been attending a pre-arranged meeting with local lords in a wood at Aberedw. Whatever the reason, this separation left him vulnerable. An English force, composed of Marcher troops under the command of John Giffard, Edmund Mortimer, and Roger Lestrange, had been shadowing the Welsh army and saw an opportunity. The main engagement took place at Orowyn Bridge, where the bulk of the Welsh army was positioned. While the English forces engaged the Welsh at the bridge, a detachment was guided to a ford further down the river, allowing them to cross and attack the Welsh flank. During this chaos, Llywelyn was ambushed. Accompanied by only a small retinue, he was caught unawares in the woods by an English man-at-arms named Stephen de Frankton. Reportedly unaware of the prince's identity, Frankton ran him through with a lance. It was only after the fact, as the Welsh army was routed, that the mortally wounded prince was identified. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. News of the prince's death shattered the morale of the Welsh forces, and the battle turned into a slaughter. The true finality of the event was sealed by the English treatment of his body. Llywelyn's head was severed and sent to King Edward at Rhuddlan. From there, it was dispatched to London. In a final act of humiliation, it was crowned with ivy, in mockery of an old Welsh prophecy, and paraded through the streets before being fixed upon a spike at the Tower of London. The symbolic death of the last native Prince of Wales was now complete. The death of Llywelyn at Silmeri decapitated the Welsh rebellion, but it did not immediately extinguish it. Leadership of the faltering cause fell to his brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, who now assumed the title of Prince of Wales. Retreating into the mountain fortresses of Snowdonia, he attempted to continue the resistance. For 6 months, Dafydd remained at large, a symbol of defiance in a land increasingly overrun by English forces. King Edward I, however, was determined to make the conquest absolute and final. He initiated a vast and systematic campaign to hunt down the last Welsh prince. An enormous army, numbering over 7,000 men, was methodically deployed to encircle and penetrate the remaining pockets of resistance in Gwynedd. English troops occupied castles, cleared forests, and built new roads to ensure no sanctuary remained. The hunt for Dafydd was relentless, a tightening noose that left him with ever-dwindling support and territory. In June 1283, the end came not on a battlefield, but through betrayal. Dafydd, along with his wife, 2 sons and 7 daughters, was captured in a hidden bog called Nanhisglain, near Berrymore. The men who led the English to his hiding place were themselves Welsh, a final bitter testament to the fracturing of the cause. Captured alongside him were the last remaining regalia of the Welsh principality, including the revered coronet of Arthur. Edward's retribution was to be both political and savagely personal. Dafydd was transported to Shrewsbury to face a specially convened parliament. He was not tried as a captured enemy combatant, but as a traitor to the English king. His sentence was unprecedented in its calculated brutality, a new punishment devised specifically for the crime of high treason. On October 3rd, 1283, Dafydd was subjected to a horrific public execution. He was dragged through the streets by a horse for his treason, hanged alive for murdering English knights, then disemboweled, and his entrails burned for committing his crimes during the Holy Week of Easter. Finally, his body was quartered for plotting against the king. His head was sent to join his brothers on a spike at the Tower of London, while his quartered remains were dispatched to be displayed in 4 different cities across England. The execution of Dafydd ap Gruffudd was the brutal and unequivocal end of Welsh independence. With the rebellion crushed and the line of Welsh princes extinguished, Edward I's military conquest to permanent administrative subjugation. At his Welsh headquarters in Rhuddlan Castle, On the 3rd of March 1284, he enacted the Statute of Rhuddlan, a legal framework that would systematically dismantle the native governance of Wales and formally annex its territories to the English crown. This was not a treaty, but a dictate, the constitutional blueprint for the government of a conquered land. The statute's primary function was to replace the indigenous Welsh administrative and legal systems with English ones. The lands of the former Principality of Gwynedd were carved into new English-style shires, Anglesey, Caernarfonshire and Merionethshire, later joined by Flintshire. These new counties were to be administered not by Welsh lords but by royal officials appointed by the English king. The statute introduced a host of new administrative posts that were entirely alien to the Welsh system. Offices such as the Justice of Snowdon, the Chamberlain, sheriffs, coroners and bailiffs were established to enforce royal authority. These new positions directly superseded and erased the traditional Welsh administrative units of the Comote and the Cantref, which had been the bedrock of Welsh society for centuries. The most profound change came with the imposition of English law. The Statute of Rhuddlan formally abolished the use of Welsh law, the Cyfraith Hywel, for criminal cases. This meant the end of the long-standing Welsh practice of resolving disputes through compensation, such as the galannas, or blood fine, paid for homicide. In its place came the harsher English system of corporal and capital punishment, where felonies were punished by death. While the statute did permit the continuance of some Welsh customs in civil law, particularly concerning land inheritance, this was a pragmatic concession to avoid total social collapse, rather than a gesture of respect for Welsh tradition. The overall legal landscape was now fundamentally English. The statute effectively ended the political entity of the Principality of Wales, absorbing it into the dominion of the English monarch. It was a calculated and thorough piece of statecraft, designed not merely to punish rebellion, but to erase the very structures of Welsh independence and ensure the land would be governed as an extension of England under one king and one system of law. To secure his conquest, Edward I initiated one of the most ambitious and expensive military building programs in European history. The administrative changes of the Statute of Rhuddlan were to be enforced by a network of stone fortresses, a so-called Iron Ring, designed to encircle the heartland of Welsh resistance in Gwynedd and permanently project English power. This was not a defensive line, but a system of strategic domination. The architect of this colossal undertaking was Master James of Street George, a Savoyard military engineer renowned as the foremost castle builder of his age. Edward brought him to Wales and gave him immense resources to design and oversee the construction. The cost was staggering, ultimately consuming more than 10 times the annual income of the English crown and requiring a massive logistical effort. Tens of thousands of labourers, masons, carpenters and engineers were conscripted from across England and brought to Wales to execute the plans. The castles were placed with meticulous strategic calculation. Fortresses like Conwy and Caernarfon were built on sites of former Welsh political importance, deliberately supplanting symbols of native authority. Crucially, they were positioned on the coast or on navigable rivers, allowing them to be supplied by sea. This was a critical innovation, ensuring that English garrisons could be provisioned and reinforced indefinitely, bypassing the hostile Welsh countryside where land-based supply columns were vulnerable to ambush. Architecturally, these were not the simple motte and bailey castles of the earlier Marcher lords. They were the pinnacle of late 13th century military technology. Incorporating features learned during the Crusades, they featured concentric walls, creating multiple layers of defence. Powerful, multi-towered gatehouses became formidable strongholds in their own right. Symmetrically planned layouts, dotted with towers providing interlocking fields of fire for archers, left no blind spots for an attacking force. Castles like Harlech, perched on its dramatic rock outcrop, and Beaumaris, the technically perfect but unfinished concentric masterpiece on Anglesey, were designed to be impregnable. These fortresses were more than just military bases. They were centres of English administration and commerce. Adjoining each major castle, Edward established fortified English boroughs, or bastides, populated exclusively by English settlers who were granted commercial privileges. The native Welsh were often forbidden from living within the town walls, effectively creating a system of colonial control where military, political, and economic power was held firmly in English hands. Among the great fortresses of the Iron Ring, Caernarfon Castle was designed with a purpose that transcended mere military strategy. Its polygonal towers and walls banded with coloured stone were a deliberate evocation of the imperial majesty of Constantinople, a clear architectural statement that Edward I saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as the heir to Roman authority in Britain. It was within this potent symbol of a new order that Edward orchestrated his final act of political theatre to cement the subjugation of Wales. In April 1284, a heavily pregnant Queen Eleanor of Castile was brought to the still under construction castle. On the 25th of April, within the cold stone walls of the Eagle Tower, she gave birth to a son, Edward of Caernarfon. A popular and enduring legend, likely of later Tudor origin, claims the king presented his infant son to the assembled Welsh nobility, promising them a prince who was born in Wales and could speak no word of English. While the historical accuracy of this specific event is doubtful, the strategic intent behind the birth was unmistakable. By ensuring his heir was born on Welsh soil, within a fortress built to dominate the heartland of the old princes of Gwynedd, Edward was physically embedding his dynasty into the conquered land. The ultimate appropriation, however, was not of land, but of a title. The designation Prince of Wales, once a symbol of native Welsh sovereignty, fiercely defended by Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, was now to be co-opted. For years, the young Edward was known simply as the Lord of Snowdon, or Edward of Caernarfon. But in February 1301, at a parliament held in Lincoln, Edward I formally invested his 16-year-old son with the title of Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. This was a deliberate and calculated political act. It transferred the highest symbol of Welsh nationhood to the English heir apparent, fundamentally altering its meaning from a native dignity to a possession of the English crown. The investiture established a tradition that would endure for centuries, ensuring that the title once held by the last independent Welsh ruler would henceforth be bestowed upon the English monarch's eldest son. With the death of the princes and the imposition of the Statute of Rhuddlan, the era of Welsh independence concluded, giving way to a new and stark reality of direct English rule. For the Welsh people, the aftermath of the conquest was a period of profound and often brutal adjustment. The military occupation, symbolised by the ever-present stone castles, was now interwoven with a comprehensive administrative and legal system designed to permanently subordinate Wales to the English crown. The new English shires, governed by royally appointed sheriffs and bailiffs, systematically supplanted the traditional Welsh commotes, dismantling the native structures of local governance that had ordered society for centuries. This new administration was staffed almost exclusively by Englishmen, creating a foreign ruling class that held judicial and financial power over the native population. Economically, the Welsh were marginalised by the establishment of the fortified boroughs. These new towns, populated by English merchants and artisans, were granted royal charters that gave them monopolies on trade and commerce in their surrounding districts. The native Welsh were often legally barred from residing within the town walls, holding office, or carrying arms. They were relegated to the status of a rural underclass, forced to bring their goods to English-controlled markets, and subjected to tolls and taxes that enriched the settler population and the crown. This economic apartheid was a deliberate tool of policy, designed to break the financial independence of the Welsh and foster a loyal English commercial class. The social hierarchy was irrevocably altered. The Uchelwyr, the native Welsh aristocracy who had once formed the backbone of the prince's power, found themselves dispossessed and disempowered. While some managed to retain a portion of their lands by submitting to English authority, their status was greatly diminished. They became minor gentry within an English feudal framework, their former political influence erased. The suppression of Welsh law in criminal matters introduced a foreign and harsher judicial system, replacing the compensatory traditions of Cyfraith Hywel with English courts that favoured corporal and capital punishment. This new reality was not accepted passively. Resentment simmered, and the harshness of the new administration provoked violent reactions. In 1294, a major uprising led by Madog ap Llywelyn, a distant relative of the last prince, swept across Wales, temporarily capturing several of Edward's new castles. Though ultimately crushed, the revolt demonstrated the deep-seated opposition to the English settlement and the enduring desire to resist foreign domination. The conquest of 1282 did not mark the end of Welsh history, but rather the end of its political sovereignty. While the structures of the independent kingdoms were systematically dismantled, the cultural foundations laid over the preceding 8 centuries proved far more resilient. The legacy of medieval Wales was not one of castles and crowns, but of an identity that endured through the persistence of its language, its legal memory, and its unique social fabric. The most crucial vehicle for this survival was the Welsh language, Cymraeg. With the disappearance of the princely courts, English became the language of law, administration, and commerce, but Welsh remained the language of the hearth, the community, and the church. The great bardic tradition, deprived of its royal patrons, adapted. Poets, now supported by the surviving Welsh gentry, continued to compose in the strict metres, preserving the literary heritage and ensuring the language's prestige. This linguistic continuity was the bedrock of a distinct identity, a private world of meaning and history that existed beyond the reach of English officialdom. Similarly, the legal framework of Cyfraith Hywel was not entirely extinguished by the Statute of Rhuddlan. While English common law governed criminal proceedings, many aspects of Welsh civil law, particularly concerning land inheritance and social status, continued to be practiced among the Welsh population for generations. This persistence of native legal thought maintained a sense of a distinct social order and a different way of understanding justice and obligation. The historical and mythological narratives codified during the Age of the Princes became even more vital after the loss of independence. The tales of the Mabinogion and the heroic poetry celebrating the resistance of leaders from Owain Gwynedd to Llywelyn ap Gruffydd were no longer just entertainment. They were foundational texts of a nation, teaching a history of sovereignty and a shared sense of belonging. The idea of the Cymry, the fellow countryman, forged in the early medieval period, was now sustained by a powerful collective memory of a time before the conquest. This cultural resilience ensured that while the medieval kingdoms of Wales had fallen, the Welsh nation, defined by its own language, memory, and customs, would survive. The echo of those lost kingdoms provided the strength and the sense of self that would carry the Welsh people through centuries of foreign rule, a quiet but unbreakable thread connecting them back to the Age of the Princes.